two, one, two, three.
Hello and welcome to Ithaca DSA Presents. I'm here today with Brianna Foster. She's the chair of the Ithaca Tenants Union. We'll be talking about the situation at Asteri. I'm familiar with the origins of Asteri. The city owned the Green Street garage and the land under it. The garage needed to be rebuilt. After some citizen agitation, the city opened a competition. The deal was to produce a conference center, a garage, and housing. The Vecino company won the competition. So, Brianna Foster, tell us when Asteri opened.
Yes. So Asteri opened in August of 2024, and it was open to much fanfare. You can still today see the press releases in local news and also at the governor's office. And it was really touted as a sort of modern utopia. There were not only modern builds, high-speed internet, and a lot of really awesome features that tenants would enjoy, like a sky terrace, but it was also designed to help low-income and tenants who were transitioning out of homelessness. So it was a really ambitious project. I believe it was also all electric, so it was supposed to be a green project as well. So there were a lot of high hopes and ambitions when it opened, and it really did receive much fanfare in the hopes of the city.
What issues then arose after it opened?
Yeah, so there is a big dichotomy that I think is really interesting between when it opened and what it was promised to be and what it turned into that we're all kind of seeing today. So something I like to touch on, and I can kind of break it down into two issues and where things fell apart, if that's all right. The first thing is, especially in relation to the tenants that were a part of the 40 units of transitioning out of homelessness. Um, those folks were provided or promised at least a number of supportive services. So that's, life skills, job help, financial literacy, really important things like that. And that was supposed to be provided by staff, and that was really a tenet of the building of the building that Vecino put up. But as time went on, those supportive services kind of fell apart. It's not a secret and can be seen on the Ithaca Voice, and also if you talk to an Asteri resident, someone who's worked at Asteri, the turnover is incredibly high. They're a hard group to work for. There's been a lot of issues with those that have worked there, and so the people that were, in need of those support services that were promises to them ended up really not receiving them due to the issues with the staffing, which is really unfortunate. We're also seeing in terms of the building condition itself that has really deteriorated. Again, to reiterate what we talked about in the opening of the Asteri building, Vecino touted that this was going to be just, a really awesome hub for the residents that were using it, fitness rooms, clean modern build, things like that. And that has just severely deteriorated since its inception. If you look again at the lawsuit that tenants have taken out against the Vecino group, so there's 9 tenants that have taken out a lawsuit against Vecino Group. This is in the local news, things like that. And they're represented by Law New York, which is a really great group. And that outlines a lot of the issues that we're seeing today with the building conditions. And if you talk to any Asteri resident, which I have, they also unfortunately echo those kind of horrors that they're seeing in the building. We're talking electricity outages, hot water outages, and that's just a fundamental, piece of the warrant of habitability. So real property law, section 235B, which is a really key piece of protection that tenants have for a safe, clean, livable housing. There's also now human and animal excrement in the stairwells. There's been reports of hypodermic needles throughout the building. And the trash situation actually specifically has been really bad to the point where the Department of, I believe, um, the environmental, you just double check that there. the environmental health division of the county and the health department cited Vecino for their sort of negligence in terms of waste removal and keeping the trash room up to code. So it was just a really bad situation. Security, the security that should be provided was just kind of falling through. It was not adequate, and the doors often experienced like faulty locks, things like that. But what's really a travesty there is these issues were reported by residents. This was not a building that was, thankfully suffering in silence. These residents really, to their credit, used their voices to try and make people aware of these issues. And I think local news, especially credit to the Ithaca Voice, did a great job in highlighting those issues, but they fell on deaf ears in terms of the Vecino group that should have done their job and really kept up the building, unfortunately.
In terms of the problems with the supportive services, I'm wondering, I mean, one thing one often hears about many human services is that the service providers are so weakly paid, so badly paid that they don't stay in the jobs.
Yeah, it's definitely a consideration. I unfortunately don't know the whole scope of
Yeah.
the working situation there, but I've heard from tenants and employers that there's just a really, really high turnover at Asteri. And if you read any articles in terms of like, especially the Ithaca Voices inside Asteri, they cover sort of the staffing situation. And to my knowledge, and from that article, there was staff that were being fired, so not even leaving on their own volition, but staff that were fired from that supportive role. And also there was a lot of tension in terms of building management, those trying to provide supportive services. So it created what sounds like to me a very toxic environment that was not really working to benefit the residents that it should have been, unfortunately.
Yeah, I mean, another thing that I heard, I can't, honestly don't know where, was that Vecino rushed a bit too fast to fill all the apartments
Mm.
and therefore filled a lot of the apartments that were not designed for people who needed services with people who, in fact, needed services.
Yeah.
And the service providers who were there for 40 apartments were now trying to deal with far more than 40 apartments and eventually just couldn't keep up.
Yeah, that's an interesting point. I can't really say specifically about the makeup of the tenants that live at Asteri. I don't have specifics on that, but I do think it's a very interesting point that you raise because while the support services are really supportive, so supposed to be narrowed in on those 40 specific units that we've been mentioning, they are supposed to be available to everyone in the building. And so if you have 181 units, and that's just units, it could be a larger number of tenants that you're trying to support, you're going to need a really robust model and staffing system to sort of support those residents and keep that building afloat. And Vecino really just did not do their job in setting that building up for success in that regard.
Yeah, I think it may have been bigger than any building they had tried before.
I am not sure. It's a really interesting point because they are also behind Art House, which
Yeah,
is another unit in Ithaca, and there were similar problems, but it eventually kind of the way that it was described is it's sort of like leveled out in a way, and things are it's pretty stable environment there. But it's a very very large building. It's a high rise building, and that kind of does take into consideration the issues we're seeing today with the fire codes and things like that, which we can discuss later.
so let's see. So who was supposed to be providing services?
I believe Vecino worked with the Tompkins Community Action group. I can't speak a lot to that group. I'm not too familiar with them as an organization, but I think something that's really interesting when you look at Vecino and their model and how Asteri was supposed to work. There was supposed to be a lot of partnerships with the city, and this was really supposed to be a great project that was going to benefit Ithaca as a whole. And there's now been a lot of tension and things like that, and so it's
Yeah,
just a really interesting model to read about. And unfortunately, you see a lot of those ramifications on the ground working with tenants.
yeah. Tompkins Community Action is not a city department.
Mm.
It's a not-for-profit, a
Mm.
501c3 not-for-profit.
Yeah,
I think it receives a good deal of federal money for
that seems to be my
things
understanding.
like the Head Start program, which is for little children. They also have a heating assistance program, a couple of other things. They run a house, I think, for teen parents who also, again, need some support. I don't know whether they had ever really dealt with anything like this on this scale.
Yeah, I'm not sure either. And again, as I mentioned,
Yeah.
I'm not too familiar with their group, but and that's really helpful context. So thank you for that. And yeah, it was that's kind of the key thing. It was a massive scale project that they were undertaking,
Yeah.
and Vecino was undertaking, and unfortunately did not do well, and now we're
Yeah.
kind
Well,
of.
again, about Tompkins Community Action, and this is my experience, uh, not as someone who ever needed their services, but as someone who was trying to put out a public service announcement about their services. Are all sorts of other agencies where I would see an email from them. I would cut it down to 1 minute, and then I would phone the agency and ask, have I made any mistakes in cutting it down to 1 minute? And usually the person who answered the phone could tell me either that there was a certain mistake, change this, or there wasn't a mistake. When it came to Tompkins Community Action, a different thing happened. The person who answered the phone had no right to respond to me
Hmm,
and had to pass it on up to the director or somebody like that. And I think the upshot was that I never heard back.
interesting. Yeah,
Yeah,
that's helpful context there.
I don't remember. I may have heard back, uh, but it did leave this funny feeling
Mhm.
with me that the employees aren't very information about the agency is not being shared with the employees.
Yeah.
I've run into that sort of thing as an employee at Cornell, another community not-for-profit. You talked about 9 tenants initiating a lawsuit. There were other lawsuits as well.
Yes, yeah, there is another lawsuit. I believe it's ongoing. I don't have a lot of information about that one specifically, but I think what's really interesting and speaks to the depth of what's going on at Asteri is the building is actually home to two structures. There's the Asteri building, which is for the 181 apartment units for low income tenants. But on the bottom few floors, there's a conference center. So that was really supposed to draw in a lot of tourism, traffic downtown, things like that. And the people who work there are also suing for mismanagement against Vecino because of the conditions of things. So both, you know, iterations of the building are both working, to try to get Vecino to be accountable.
Another thing that we were hearing was city police and city fire department having many calls to that building. Do you know anything about that?
I do know a little bit. I can speak both as a resident of downtown myself and through what I've heard, as a resident who has seen Asteri quite a bit. It's quite common, unfortunately, to see ambulances, fire trucks, cop cars around the building, and they're I believe from what I've read in terms of actual statistics, it is the highest. It is the place that gets the highest number of calls to first responders. There have been a number of fires that have happened in the building, hence the fire trucks and the need for the fire presence there. And I think that does really tie into what they're experiencing now with the violation of fire code because it is a very serious thing and is what eventually led to what has now happened.
If the fire department was repeatedly being called there and presumably putting out fires there, uh, why didn't they notice these violations?
I am not sure, to be honest. I can't speak to specifically how they interact with those violations because I am not sure of the entirety of fire code, but fire code and building code are kind of two silos in terms of the way they enforce things and the things they need to look out for. And so a lot of the issues that were cited that were really terrible for tenants that Vecino was ignoring, to my understanding, were not specifically related to fire issue and things like that, but were more warrant of habitability, cleanliness, things like that. And so the unfortunate and really horrible tipping point that we all saw on March 4th was when someone came in and shattered the windows of the stairwell. That was a super big hazard, but was also a fire hazard because unfortunately it would cause, to my understanding of it, like a huge oxidation input for fires. It would just feed a fire and make the exits unusable for residents. So a super huge threat to life there and violation of fire code.
It sounds like my some of my speculations that somehow the fire department must have seen the violations and failed to notify the building department. That doesn't seem to be quite accurate.
I think to my understanding, and this is just my understanding, I think they might be separate entities. So I'm not sure what the reporting structure is there. Um, but I think what's really unfortunate too is whether or not other units in the county were reporting that to the officials. Vecino Group was aware of the problems and just wasn't doing anything about it. They were really just kind of letting them continue and perpetuate and not actually taking the interventions we would want to see landlords do when their tenants are dealing with these issues.
And in fact, I remember at one point being in a city council meeting, and one of the speakers from the public was from security at Vecino,
Hmm.
saying that the whole team had quit,
I could believe it, unfortunately. Yeah, there's a very high turnover there.
which often means inadequate compensation, especially in a high cost city like Ithaca.
Absolutely.
So perhaps, I mean, the company is based in Missouri. Perhaps they were not used to our housing prices.
That's for sure. I mean, our rents are out of control, but that's a whole other bucket of worms.
Oh,
So it's something
yes.
the IT was working on actively, I'm proud to say. So
Oh, good. Well, I think ITU works on making it possible for rents not to get raised too fast and protecting the rights of tenants to stay in their apartments. And meanwhile, Ithaca Democratic Socialists of America has a housing committee that works on trying to increase the supply of housing.
yeah, absolutely. Both are really important fights and really crucial to I think the fights that Ithaca is facing and a bit of a deviation here and I appreciate you saying is the Ithaca Tenants Union was behind a very large push that helped pass good cause which keeps folks in their homes in the city of Ithaca and we're now working to support the Rest Act at the state level which would clear the way for ETPA to pass which is the Emergency Tenant Protection Act and that would allow Ithaca to become more rent stabilized. So we're really trying to work with our
Right.
legislators to get that forward and get rents capped in Ithaca, New York, because it is such a high cost city for folks and it really is the housing market here is really difficult and it's just been really tricky to navigate for a lot of folks and we want to try to make that at least a little bit better.
Yeah. Well, it's not, let's see, the Rest Act is not about getting ETPA passed. I know about this because I worked to get ETPA, well, not so much passed. It was passed by the state, but adopted. It would have had to be adopted by the city, and there were a lot of bureaucratic complications to that.
Yeah, Rest Act is sort of the
Re
hurdle remover.
replaces it.
It's
Uh,
it's awesome because so much of rent stabilization in Ithaca is guarded by what's called a vacancy study, which is something that is used to understand the vacant housing market in Ithaca. And those vacancy studies are so cumbersome, timely, and so easily challenged by folks who oppose rent stabilization, unfortunately, that the Rest Act removing that would really clear the way for us to have that passed in our city and make the city more affordable, which is cool.
right. Interestingly, there's also a state bill which is not on the really on the agenda this year, but supposedly next year, that would actually provide state money toward building state-owned and cooperatively owned housing.
Yes, yeah.
I think you brought things up to March 4th when the fire department ordered the evacuation of the building.
Yes, yeah.
Do you know where the tenants are now?
Yeah. So March 4th was a tough day for certain. I mean, it was something I think a lot about when I reflect on that day and working with the tenants directly to provide resources with the incredible group Food Not Bombs. Is there was just so much confusion when that order dropped. You know, a lot of residents found out through a paper on their door, and that was kind of how they were told to exit their homes and have to leave their homes at just the drop of a hat. And it was very confusing to the point where I think the majority of people just didn't even know what came next because there was just such a lack of clarity around communications. But thankfully, folks were put up in hotels across the city. So there was motels like the Quality Inn, I believe, few others that I can't remember off the top of my head now, unfortunately. But folks were put up in hotels, and they were paid for by Vecino for the displaced tenants. And then as of yesterday, they were allowed to start returning to their homes, I believe. So it was a long time that they were gone. You know, that's over 2 weeks if you left on the night of the notice that you were not in your home and you were away from things. And it was just really, really unfortunate to see so many people displaced with just such a haphazard implementation and for a building that had just been gone too long in terms of repairs.
And how are they moving back in? Are they getting any help for that?
A bit, to my understanding, and this is just what I've heard through community organizers, TCAT provided some support for folks, but a lot of the rides back to the place that they're to Asteri from the places that they are is coming from like volunteers. So folks that are using their cars and really trying to get there. There was just such a it's really unfortunate, I think, when you look at the situation because these tenants were displaced from their homes and the building managers did not do their part to keep the building up to date, and then they were kind of told to just figure it out, and that's really really difficult. And thankfully, community members have stepped in and tried to fill those gaps, but there was just really a lack of, I think, support and implementation in terms of the plan for those
Well,
folks.
community members, just ad hoc volunteers or
Yeah,
organ,
just volunteers and organizers. I would say both.
but I think there were also a couple of organized groups.
Yes, yeah, Food Not Bombs, ITU, um,
ITU being
the Ithaca Tenants Union. Thank you. That's us.
okay.
I know No Moth Lagrima's provided a lot of resources for folks, so
Uh-huh.
just a lot of folks really came together, and their efforts were really tremendous and helpful.
Okay, so they are coming back
Yes, yeah,
and
they're allowed to come back now. Thankfully.
hopefully, well, I think there is now an Ithaca Voice article describing some of that.
Yes, there is. They're a really great resource, I think, for folks that are looking to understand more about Asteri and read more about Asteri. As the Ithaca Tenants Union, put out a few statements about it as well. So our social media pages have how we responded in terms of our statements and what we advised residents on. So yeah, it was just overall a really, really awful situation, and I'm glad folks are back in their homes to this point because we have seen there was a case in Dryden, I believe a few years ago, that the Ithaca Tenants Union was involved in where a similar thing happened. The building fell into disrepair due to negligent landlords, and those tenants did not get to go home, unfortunately, and are still dealing with the ramifications. And it's just a really, really unfortunate situation. And so we just don't want folks to have to deal with that because we've seen it before.
So probably the ultimate answer is to get more affordable housing in the city of Ithaca or
Absolutely.
nearby places.
Yeah, we definitely, I mean, yes, definitely more affordable housing. The housing prices here are just out of control. And I think another thing is too, making sure that landlords are held accountable. I think something that's really important to think about is the way that we enforce building code and things like that in the city. And if we're only charging landlords fines that they can absorb, and it actually is more cost effective for them to absorb a fine than actually fix a building issue that is being reported to them, that's a problem, and that's what leads to things like this as well. So just making sure that we're really, you know, listening to tenants when they speak up, because these tenants have used their voices, and we should be very proud of the work and lobbying that they've done on their own behalf. But also that we're meeting them when they raise their voices, and that the city is defending them and taking care of their tenants, to put
Yeah.
it plain.
Well, and there's also the question of how the inspectors in the building department spend their time.
Oh, of course, absolutely.
Uh,
I mean, for this building to go in disrepair for so long, and also this was not a secret. This was not something that was kept hidden. Again, as I'd like to give credit to the residents who made us aware of this, but it got to the point where there had to be a lawsuit, and now we're here, and it's just really unfortunate.
well, I know that I am not a landlord, but I have been ticketed by the building department for having weeds that were more than 10 inches tall.
Oh my goodness. Wow. So
Ha-
they're really big on aesthetics, it seems.
yeah. However, when I went to pay the fine for that, the city court wouldn't accept it. They said, "Oh no, we're not enforcing these tickets. The building department is issuing them, we're not enforcing them."
Yeah, so there's just issues all around in terms of the way
Yeah,
that this enforcement is handled, and we really, just want to see a change there
yeah.
in that regard.
Thank you, Brianna Foster, for telling us a lot about Asteri and the problems there. This has been Ithaca DSA Presents. I'm Theresa Alt. Thanks for watching.
1, 2, 1, 2, 3.